on the 27th of July, something terrible began in Crimea. This is fucked up. Ukrainian Neptunes attacked 3 nuclear airfields in Crimea. Everything is on fire. No way. Absolutely no way at all. I simply cannot believe it. This is truly unbelievable. Boom. Are you filming? Yes. Unbelievable. There were explosions in Sevastopol, Simferopol, Yevpatoria, Bakhchisarai district, Alushta, Feodosia, Saki, and Novofedorivka. No way. The airfields at Saki, Khabardiski, and Kirovsky are on fire.
That's an explosion. This is a disaster.
The Ukrainian armed forces have launched powerful special operations in Crimea to destroy Russian military personnel. The nuclear triad is under attack, the Black Sea Fleet, airfields, and oil refineries.
Oh, it's coming.
The train station got hit.
We really need to get out of this place right now. It is your turn.
Give the order. Crimea was burning last night. 4 key military airfields were attacked. Where does the strategic nuclear combat base take off from?
That's fucked up.
Saki, Gvardeyskaya, Kirovskaya. Strike against aviation. 200 drones attacked Crimea last night. The drones' targets were the Saki, Gvardeyskaya, and Kirovskaya airfields. NASA satellites record a large-scale fire near the Gvardeyskaya airfield in Crimea. Another fuel tank caught fire at the Crystal oil depot in Engels. The whole city is covered in smoke. As they say, the show must go on, or the action at the Crystal oil depot in Engels has been going on for several days now. Meanwhile, Russia has lost another Su-25. Special Operation Forces destroyed the decision-making center in the Kherson direction. And also, the headquarters of the occupiers in Makivka was attacked and blown up. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, let's start with the hell in occupied Crimea, because more than 200 drones attacked 3 key military airfields, Vardiske, Saki, and Kirovsk. Novofedorivka was also attacked. The floor is yours.
Novofedorivka is a depot near Saki. So basically, it's a single complex, Novofedorivka and the Saki airfield. The strike on Crimea today was truly large scale. This is what we have repeatedly requested, let's put it mildly, on air, because we kept circling around Crimea but never touched it. It was, so to speak, a kind of sacred cow. Honestly, today was a well-executed, solid attack. Really, 200 drones can overwhelm any air defense system, any at all. Due to the large number of decoys, the Russian forces, at least the air defense units, expended a lot of missiles today, and yet quite significant damage was still inflicted on Russian airfields in Saki, near Simferopol, and of course, near Sevastopol. But the drones also managed to reach Kerch. There are 2 airfields there that are currently being prepared, I would say, as launch sites for new batches of Geran 2 and Geran 3 drones. And these 2 airfields were also attacked, at least as of now. The operation was well thought out, excellently executed, and most likely it was carried out by our army. In other words, this isn't a special operation. It's most likely standard army work. You could even say it's already under the command of Madyar, the newly appointed commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces. Although in reality, our sailors should be the ones working in Crimea, that is the Navy, the naval forces. Within the naval forces, there should be their own Madyar, their own sailor Madyar, who will create unmanned systems forces specifically focused on maritime operations, underwater, surface, and aerial systems for the liberation of Crimea. If today's attack is not a one-off but part of a systematic effort, then believe me, by the end of the year, at least half of the Russians in Crimea will have disappeared, simply vanished. Because if this happens every day, even with just 100, even 100 drones, targeting airfields will definitely be the first target. Why airfields? The Russians use airfields in several capacities. The first is as a base for tactical or army aviation. That means airplanes and helicopters. Second, they use the airfield to deploy anti-aircraft missile systems and radar units of the Russian Federation's radio technical troops. And third, they use almost all airfields as transit depots for transferring ammunition. That's why it's especially important for us, first and foremost, to destroy the airfields and everything on them, airfield technical equipment, vehicles, ammunition, and of course, the aircraft themselves.
Roman Grigorievich, I wanted to talk to you about aviation. And in the meantime, dear audience, please like this video. In the comments, write what you think about the successful operations of the Ukrainian armed forces and about the fact that Crimea should be burning military facilities, that that Russians should be swimming freestyle back to Russian territory. Roman Grigorievich, can we assume that at these airfields that were attacked last night, enemy aircraft were also targeted, or did we only strike the fuel facilities there? What do you think?
Well, Russian aircraft are not stationed at all of those airfields right now. They have mostly pulled back to central and eastern airfields in Crimea. That's why some of the airfields are used by the Russians either for army aviation, for helicopters, as forward operating bases, so-called operational forward airfields, or for deploying anti-aircraft missile systems and radio technical troops. So for us, this is very important in order to deliver serious strikes against Russian aviation. To do that, we first need to achieve air superiority. That begins with destroying ground-based surveillance and response systems, meaning those same anti-aircraft missile systems. That's exactly what has started today. The thing is, several times such operations have already begun, but then they were cut short, as if by the wave of a magic wand. How many times have we talked about this? Here's the beginning, here's the start, and then suddenly it shuts down again for a month and a half, or even two. And no one is even giving Crimea a sideways glance, at least for now. Well, right now I'm just afraid to be wrong again. If this is the beginning of Crimea's liberation, then attacks like this should happen every night. 100 drones should be flying into Crimea.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the special operation by the SBU in Novorossiysk, including the missile carriers, we see that during massive missile attacks, missile carriers go out into the Black Sea. As far as I understand, they hide them in Novorossiysk and bring them out to sea on the necessary days. The question is, how can we attack all the missile carriers today so that the Black Sea fleet ceases to exist?
Well, they have up to 100 ships and submarines left. Both submarines there are 4 of team and surface ships serve as missile carriers, at least as carriers of caliber missiles. The submarines mainly carry 4 caliber missiles in their torpedo tubes, while the ships can have 4, 6, or even 8. Well, it depends on what kind of launcher is installed. A few months ago, our banking company with the Saudis committed not to strike Russian oil refineries, the Russian oil industry, and also the Black Sea fleet. That's why they now feel at home, so to speak, at least in the eastern waters of the Black Sea. So here, the question is, first of all, for the politicians. Well, actually, not even for the politicians. Now it's a question for the intelligence services. Why haven't they yet arrested for treason those politicians who ensure the security of Russian hydrocarbons and the Russian Black Sea fleet? The Russians are leaving the base, let's say, Novorossiysk, going out to sea only to avoid being hit. That is, when they enter the base, it's a compact area with a high concentration of Russian ships. They leave to avoid being hit and then naturally return, mainly for maintenance purposes.
As for whether Ukrainian intelligence services could do something similar, but on Russian territory, do our capabilities match theirs? Let's discuss this.
Well, from a military standpoint, the preparation and execution of the operation were at the highest level. Intelligence services were involved, including Mossad and several other Israeli agencies, plus the Air Force. Again, pay attention, the main thing here is the Air Force. In other words, long-range strike capabilities. About 200 fighter jets or various types of aircraft took off and struck previously identified targets. Moreover, the air defense systems had been practically neutralized beforehand by a Mossad special operation. So it was a combined attack, well thought out, well prepared, and well executed. But that's from a military perspective. It's like if we were now discussing whether the executioner's axe that beheaded some king was well sharpened. Well, it was well sharpened, no doubt about that. The question is, why was there a need to behead at all? That's a different question, a different aspect. The fact is, Israeli strikes on Iran at this point would ignite a war in the Middle East, and that would affect us as well. At the very least, it would hit us first by driving up oil prices. Right now, the price of oil has already risen by more than 10%, and it could go up by as much as 30%. In other words, the price of oil could potentially rebound to a significant $100 per barrel. This would mean that Russia would consequently receive twice as many petrodollars as they did before. For some time, there had been a noticeable trend towards significantly lower oil prices, a trend that directly contributed to a weakening Russian economy. Now it's all the opposite, a complete turnaround. There will be a rise in oil prices, an increase in revenues for the Russian hydrocarbon sector, and naturally a growth in the production of military equipment, procurement of ammunition, and the enlistment of new recruits. So the war in the Middle East will hit us very hard by boosting Russia. And at the very moment when it was necessary to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon sector, our banking cabal shielded Russian oil and gas facilities from attacks by our intelligence services and our military. How can we counteract this? By reactivating the sanctions mechanism. The most effective sanctions against the Russian oil and gas sector are its complete destruction, especially since it is practically asking to be destroyed. But in the very end, even Russian partisans are actively doing this. We clearly see how they deliberately set destructive fires to vast forests where crucial Russian oil pipelines run, how they ignite significant fires, as we previously mentioned, even in the distant Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic. Well, first and foremost, it is important to acknowledge that we currently find ourselves in a position where we possess absolutely no means, resources, or tools whatsoever to undertake or accomplish the task at hand, leaving us entirely unable to proceed with any action regarding it. Believe me, if we had the means, some of our organizations would have done it long ago. We don't have missiles, we don't have ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, although we should have them in a missile country, which Ukraine is, and yet we have no missiles. Well, it's both laughable and tragic. This is a question for the authorities, for all the authorities. In over 30 years of our independence, we have ended up without missiles during Russian offensive operations. That's why we can and should definitely do this, but it has to be us who does it. Us. No one is going to do anything for us, and there's no point in asking anyone. We have to do this ourselves and strike at the Russian leadership, including those who are where? In the Kremlin, the Rublyovka bathhouses and the Kremlin. How long have we been talking about this? 3 years. What should we have for this? What should it be? Strikes against certain Iranian military targets. Well, first of all, nuclear facilities. Well, it's not that easy to reach a nuclear facility. For example, the facility that was attacked by the Israelis is buried more than 50 meters underground. You can't just get to it like that. That's one. And second, above this facility, above the centrifuges and the reactor, there's an 8-meter thick layer of concrete. So they really went all out in preparing. So in reality, Iran's nuclear facilities haven't actually been damaged. Bushehr, the plant there, runs on Russian fuel, and in that sense, it hasn't been touched at all. There are about 5 or 6 Iranian facilities, and basically they only try to hit one of them, but even then they only managed to strike from above, while inside everything kept running as usual. The centrifuges are still spinning, so what will Iran's response be? Well, who knows? Especially now that Pandora's box has been opened. In other words, there was a strike on a nuclear facility. So now Iran could strike back with nuclear materials, even with nuclear waste after all. They could take the waste out of Bushehr, and if they scatter strontium and cesium over Israel, it would be impossible to live there for 24,000 years, at least according to the half-life of cesium. And if they hit with uranium-235 or uranium-238, one has a half-life of 700 million years and the other 4.5 billion years. So can you imagine what would happen to Israel in that? So again, who will end up suffering? The Zionists will slip away. They'll flee to the United States. It will be the ordinary, everyday Israelis who are left behind, the ones who will bear the brunt of this radiation. These are things that must never be allowed to happen. Strikes on nuclear facilities are absolutely unacceptable by definition. There are certain international control mechanisms, like the IAEA, and it has been granted access there in some respects. A continuation of the 2015 agreement was already practically ready, again under IAEA supervision together with the Europeans. That's why the Israelis launched a preemptive strike solely to prevent the agreement with Europe and the IAEA. In other words, they did not give Iran the opportunity to sign this agreement. If there had been an agreement, it would have worked just as the 2015 to 2018 agreement did, with the IAEA fully monitoring all stages of uranium enrichment. And so now the Israelis have created for themselves, or rather, that's not quite right. The Israelis have created a problem for ordinary Israelis. And what will the response be? Well, it's not easy to say right away, but the Iranians aren't simple people either, believe me. There are an order of magnitude more of them, at least in terms of numbers. And no one is going to forgive things like this. So ahead lies a serious bloody war, which for us, it's a negative. It hasn't brought us any positives, and it won't. Why? Because the Shaheds that everyone talks about, the Iranian ones and so on, are actually the Chinese Sunflower 200. The Russian Jiran is not an Iranian Shahed. The Russian Jiran is the Chinese Sunflower 200. No matter how many military facilities you destroy in Iran, the Russians will keep assembling the Chinese Sunflower 200 from Chinese parts and calling it Jiran, just like before. If you really want to target the main production plants, then you need to go after the Chinese ones. What are the Israelis going to fly to China to destroy Chinese factories? That's something our intelligence agencies should be doing. These are questions for our intelligence agency.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Dear audience, please like this video. Let us know what you think in the comments. We're returning to our main topic, the Russian aggression, the war Russia is waging against Ukraine. Roman Grigorievich, regarding the oil depot, for example, at the Crystal oil depot in Engels, another fuel tank has caught fire. The whole city is covered in smoke. Essentially, drones attacked the oil depot on the night of the 5th of June to 6th, but the fire still hasn't been extinguished. Let's assess this situation.
Well, first of all, this isn't just an oil depot, or rather, it's not an ordinary oil depot. If we're talking about oil depots in Russia, there are thousands of them. In reality, it's a fuel and lubricant storage facility for the Engels 2 backup aviation airfield. And it's precisely in this capacity that it is very important to us. This is a consumable storage site, the main base and main storage for aviation kerosene. It's underground, located in karst caves and caisson reservoirs. In other words, just try to get to it. But there are tens of thousands of tons of kerosene there. So from this underground reservoir, the fuel is pumped into the supply base, into Crystal, and then, well, the base or the fuel and lubricants depot, what we call the fuel and lubricants depot. From there, it goes to refuel those same aircraft. And the point that was chosen was correct, where at least the main flow could be cut off. Of course, they also have a backup option where they can refuel directly from the caissons, but I think we'll get to those as well. So the strike on this fuel and lubricants depot was excellently executed, precisely calculated. We discussed with you before how the attack was carried out. They broke through the Russian air defense head-on using a large number of decoy drones, while the strike drones got through, took out the target, and set 3 tanks on fire at once right from the start. And until it burns out completely, this won't stop. Kerosene is an interesting product. You can actually use it to put out fires. If you take a bucket of kerosene and pour it onto a fire, it actually puts the fire out. But it's the kerosene vapors that burn. And if you heat the kerosene up to a certain temperature and then ignite the vapors, which is what happened when our drone struck them, it's almost impossible to put it out. And in fact, they don't even try to extinguish it. They just step aside, dig a trench around it, and watch until it all burns out. And as long as there's something left to burn, it will keep burning. It could keep burning for another month.
Roman Grigorievich, today's news. Russia has lost another Su-25.
Well, most likely these are losses related to technical issues. The Su-25S are already 40 years old. They've been flying since the Afghan war, since the 1980s. They were good aircraft, even excellent for their time when they were built, a solid attack aircraft. but now they're old, really old grandpas, I would say. And technologically, of course, they're falling apart. And there aren't as many airframes left as before when you could make one out of 2 or 3. So this fleet of aircraft the Russians have is dwindling. And even with losses like today, when a Russian plane was shot down.
Roman Grigorievich, over the past 2 days, we've also attacked the Moscow region. There were military targets there. Roman Grigorievich, what exactly was attacked near Moscow in the last few days? Because the drones didn't reach Moscow, but explosions were heard in the Moscow region. They say these were military targets.
Approximately 30% of the entirety of Russia's advanced and sophisticated high-tech military production capabilities are predominantly concentrated within the bustling metropolis of Moscow and its surrounding strategically important Moscow region. So a third is in Moscow and the Moscow region. That's why it's very important for us to break through and keep pushing through the Russian air defenses. It's very difficult to do this because there are at least 2 blocking detachments in place. The first is the frontal air defense. It's very hard to break through. That's in the Bryansk, Belgorod, and Tula regions, which are practically packed with air defense systems facing toward Moscow. And the second is the site-based air defense around Moscow. So sometimes when we see reports that the Russians have shot down 50 or 70 of our drones in the Bryansk and Belgorod regions, those were headed for Moscow. Mostly they're shooting down decoys, which cost just a few $100s each, but the missile to shoot them down costs tens of thousands of dollars, and yet some still get through. And so there was a strike in the Moscow region on one of the factories that produces electronic circuit boards. As I said, this is a high-tech production facility, and at least for now, the technological process has been halted. But honestly, to actually reach Moscow, you need ballistic missiles. In other words, without ballistic missiles, we won't be able to break through Moscow's site-based air defense. Drones won't be able to take it out.
Roman Grigorievich, in the Moscow region, a microelectronics factory in Zubovo was attacked. There's a hole in the roof. The factory in Zubovo is a production complex that's part of the Rezoni Technopark in the Moscow region. It specializes in the production of printed circuit boards, electronic and electrical components for various industries, including defense and industrial sector. That's what this is about.
That's exactly what I was talking about, yes. So they hit Rezonit directly. The technological process has been halted. That's the most important thing. But it can only be destroyed with ballistic missiles. Well, even a drone carrying 50 kilograms won't be able to completely disable any military facility.
Roman Grigorievich, from a military standpoint, how many years would it take for Ukraine to develop ballistic missiles, not just a few, of course, but to have them in mass production? So that, how long would that take? 1,000 missiles a year? If we take examples from other countries that produce ballistic missiles?
Well, the thing is, Ukraine is a missile-producing country. Back in the Soviet Union, we had a full production cycle for several types of missiles, starting from air-to-air and air-to-ship missiles. Take the Kh-35 and Kh-35U, from which the Neptune missile was developed. This is an aircraft-launched anti-ship missile. So a ship-launched missile from the air, we produced it entirely, the full production cycle. There were several other missiles of this kind as well. And as for ballistics, we produce ballistic missiles. These are cruise missiles, if you can call them that. The Kh-35U especially is already at this level. And as for ballistics, we produced intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Satan SS-18, yes, produced by our Yuzmash. It has a range of 11,000 kilometers. You could reach Beijing and Pyongyang with it, if you wanted to. So we have preserved this entire technological chain, the technical documentation, the production system, very important mechanisms for certain tests, test stands, and of course the engineering staff. We were producing there 10 years ago, launched the GROM, a whole complex that we created with a $100 million investment from Saudi Arabia and then sold it to them. So that was just a few years ago. In other words, we have the entire production base for manufacturing ballistic missiles. We're not starting from scratch. In order to launch, say, serial production of those same GROM missiles with a range of 500 kilometers, we would need somewhere around $150 to $200 million and about a year and a half to 2 years. So if this government had started this 6 years ago, by now we could have launched serial production of the GROM 2-3 times over. If at this point we don't have this GROM missile, and we don't, because otherwise it would have already hit Moscow long ago, means that for 6 years, this government has just been dragging its feet. That's the big problem. It's long past time to send the executive branch to the armed forces of Ukraine. I've said it so many times already, we need to Shmailize the executive branch. For that, we don't need elections or re-elections. It's all in accordance with our constitution, within the legal framework of our laws, and we need to replace the executive branch. Shmihal and his team just aren't up to the task. They're absolutely not up to it. Umarov, Shmihal, and all the rest of the Shmihal crowd are not in the right positions. They need to be replaced with professionals who understand how to quickly launch a program like a ballistic one, or how to restructure the country's economy for wartime. But that's an entire process. The work should be done by military personnel, those with basic military education who also understand economics. We have enough people like that.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up. So, Special Operations Forces destroyed the Russian decision-making center in the Kherson direction. The Russian headquarters in Makivka was also attacked. The video report of the HIMARS MLRS strike was for the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So everyone wrote that there were many killed, many wounded. The floor is yours.
Well, about Makivka, I'm from Makivka myself. I've been saying for a while now, why aren't we hitting their rear positions? So most likely our missile troops thought so that Svitan wouldn't start cursing left and right. They just went ahead and struck Makivka. The main thing is it was not far from my house. So they accomplished the combat mission, of course. Well done, the range allows it. We have the means to strike. HIMARS work well at that range. And of course, in Kherson, on the so-called southern front as well, there's some serious Russian activity going on there right now. They're still at a crossroads deciding where to send the remaining reserves, either to reinforce the Zaporizhia direction, meaning the operations there, or to the right bank of the Dnipro near Kherson. In other words, they still haven't decided, because the reserves that could have helped them in either direction were burned by Putin before May 9th, as he set unrealistic, sickly, impossible objectives. So right now, at this moment, we can say, let's thank Putin for his complete idiocy in strategic planning, because it's precisely his idiocy, this political trap, that's now giving us a breather. We still have about 2 months before the next wave of reserves arrives, and during these 2 months, we can give the Russians a hard time. Well, we'll see what exactly we'll be giving them a hard time for, and we'll talk about it in each of our reviews.
Roman Grigorievich, we're already at the end. The armed forces of Russia have entered Yablonivka in the Sumy region, according to Deep State. That's 26 kilometers from the regional center. The gray zone has also expanded in Yunakivka, a village at the epicenter of the fighting. Please comment on this, it's very important.
Yablonivka and Yunakivka, well, yesterday they said they were 20 kilometers from Sumy, and now it's already 26 kilometers. So does that mean they're having a negative offensive or something? They've retreated 6 kilometers in the opposite direction. That's about where they are, somewhere between 20 and 30 kilometers. They're milling around and will keep milling around in this area. It's a small bridgehead, even if you look at it from the perspective of just the Sumy region, not to mention all of Ukraine. A small bridgehead that the Russians jumped into on the heels of our retreating troops. That was already a mistake made by our politicians. Here, we were thanking Putin for his political decision. Here, it was the mistake of our politicians who held our troops in offensive positions on the Kursk direction almost to the point of disaster, practically to catastrophe. Then we had to run because, you see, the politicians wanted to have negotiations with the Saudis from a better position at the very least. Nothing happened for them, but we had to retreat from the Kursk region. And as our troops were withdrawing, the Russians rushed into the Sumy region right on their heels. But I'll say it again, this is about the same level as what happened in the Kharkiv region. They are now in the area of Liptsi, in the area of Vovchansk. So they rushed in, and that's it, they got stuck. In the same way, the Russians will be stuck just around Yablonivka, Yanakivka, and so on. But not beyond that. They won't advance any further. That is, on the one hand, there are serious fortifications there. And secondly, that's the first thing. And secondly, reserves have now been redirected there, and our troops have already recovered from the strategic failure of our politicians. They've already recovered, and now in some areas we're even regaining our previously lost positions, pushing the Russians back, and we're advancing toward the course direction toward Tetkino, which is near the western. The Russians entered our territory and we entered theirs. Nonsense.
Friends, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week on my YouTube channel Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to discuss the military and political situation. Write a few kind words in the comments to support Ukraine. What do you think about Israel's special operation? And also let us know where you're watching from. Share your location in the comments. The well-known military analyst Roman Grigorievich, thank you. And as usual, see you again on Monday.